Recording now, and probably everyone might have to give permission on their machines for recording to go ahead. So the way, so welcome everybody who's coming on in now. I won't keep welcoming people as they come in because it's like really annoying to stop the flow of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to start off today talking quite specifically about bulbs, and then I am going to hand over to Holly, whose expertise is actually much more interesting than mine because it's much encompasses the wider phenomenon of biodiversity and the activities of pollinators, of beneficial insects that are really fundamental, not just to the health of our world, but our world at all. I mean, you might have come across Einstein's quote, really famous quote, then I'm going to kind of freestyle his quote, which is essentially, if you lose bees, which are a fundamental part of beneficial insects, that's it. Humanity is going to starve. So we have a major vested interest in keeping our planet going, and all of us have a very small contribution that can be made, and you know, every small contribution forms part of a unified entity that makes a difference. So I am going to talk specifically now about bulbs because we are moving into bulb season. It might be a bit depressing that summer's over. So I know myself, I kind of mourn that for a short while and then think, yay, what is the most optimistic thing that you can do now into next month, September, October, is start to think about the spring. And I have to admit that I get to about the middle of November and then wonder, so is spring here yet? Are we in spring yet? That goes on for another 3 months. And for those who have planted bulbs, depending on what bulbs you're planting, you get these optimistic little points of green poking out of the ground sometime the beginning of March or a bit earlier if you are planting snowdrops. And this is the most forward-thinking activity that you can do now, is this expression of hope that you're putting bulbs into the ground and you simply wait. And that patience and that autumn activity comes to fruition when you see banks of the early flowering daffodils that are basically saying, thank you for thinking of us in September. So I'm going to start screen share now so that I can somewhat illustrate. Can everybody see this? That I can illustrate a little bit of what I'm talking about. And what I am talking about is the phenomenon of a bulb, which is loosely described as plants growing from an underground mass of storage tissues. So all of this stuff here that you see, and actually what's quite interesting to do as an activity, not just with children, but just with your own self, is if you buy a bulb, just take one of them and cut them in half, and you will be astonished to see that everything that comes both above the ground in the spring and goes below the ground as well. So the shoots, the leaves, the flower stem, and the curled up flower bud, as well as the everything that goes underground, is there in the bulb in its embryonic state, so that you can see here, the flower bulb is here. This is the embryonic shoot, the stem, the leaves are here, the roots are here. It's all kind of squished up into this kind of lunchbox of a container, waiting for the soil to warm up enough that will give the hormones within this entire organism the kind of kickstart to say, oh, okay, we're ready to start growing. And they store, and these bulbs store enough starch and carbohydrate in this little organ here to keep them going underground without any additional nutrients, so that when you plant bulbs in the autumn, you don't have to do anything else except you need some soil, obviously, but there's nothing else that you need to add to it to kind of encourage growth. It's a self-contained unit. It's a really amazing container. So here we've got, as I said, the cross section, and then we've got here a little bit of a photograph. So these scales here, which are the leaves, the base of the leaves are the food storage unit. And this is why, for those who've planted bulbs before or may have picked up information, or you just know this yourself, is that the suggestion is always, once the flower head has died back and the leaves are beginning to get a little bit brown and kind of look floppy and rather unsightly. I know that if you are a bit of a perfectionist gardener, the desire is just to cut everything off because it kind of looks messy. Don't do it. Don't do this, because as the leaves and the flower head are dying back, it's actually pumping nutrients back into the bulb, into the storage organ, to keep it going for the following year underground. So for those who, as I say, like a neater look, you're going to have to just hold yourself back until probably 6 weeks after the flower head has died back. And then once the leaves are brown and papery, you can then snip them off. So bulbs are naturally perennials. And when I use the word perennial, it means that it'll come back into flower year on year. There are a bunch of plants that are described as perennial. Some of them are not bulbs. Some of them are herbaceous plants, and that perhaps is for another presentation, all these kind of specifications and categorizations of plants. But the word perennial just means you whack these things into the ground once, and with a bit of good fortune and reasonable weather, year on year, they will be flowering again. So in terms of a bulb, they are divided into two categories. Well, you can divide them into categories in different ways, but one of the ways that you can divide them into categories are those that are early spring flowering. So those are the ones that you see in huge displays on verges of daffodils and early tulips. And those are the plants, those are the bulbs that you're putting into the ground September, October. You could even get away by the beginning of November. I mean, you will have a bit of a later display. By the middle of November, it's probably a bit late. So those are those bulbs that do well in, they need a period of cold. They need cold temperatures both above ground and below ground in order to kickstart that flowering period in March. There is another category of bulbs, such as lilies in particular. Canna lilies are an example of that. That you would only plant in the spring, and they are summer flowering bulbs. Those are too tender to cope with the cold soil temperatures in the British climate or Northern European climate. If you think about where those bulbs originated from, they would have come from Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, Far Eastern climates, where the winters are far less harsh, so that if you are planting lily bulbs in Mediterranean climates, even like the south of Spain or the south of Italy, that doesn't get as cold as this. And I'm not sure about this, but I wonder even in Cornwall, where you've got the Gulf Stream, where weirdly you have palm trees growing in people's front gardens, you might be able to manage. But certainly anywhere north of Somerset, Don't put these bulbs into the ground with your daffodils and your tulips, because they will freeze and rot, which is pretty interesting. So as I was saying, the hardy bulbs, the tulips and daffodils, they absolutely need a period of cold that is called vernalization. And these are lilies, by the way. So also the size of the bulbs are pretty impressive compared to a daffodil bulb. They're huge. And these are lily flowers that need to be taken up. So if you're planting lilies, it's not a bad idea to plant them in pots, actually, so that when they die back, you can either, if you've got somewhere like a shed or something that is going to stave off the worst of freezing temperatures, just put the pot in the shed, or otherwise dig up the bulbs, let them dry out and put them in a cool, dark place, and put them out again from April, May. But we're going to talk specifically now about tulips and daffodils, those hardy bulbs, because this is what we're going to be ready to plant in anytime from 3 minutes after Holly and I finish talking. Rush out, get bulbs, and start digging. And it's a real fun thing to do for children as well. I mean, once you have children that are probably reception class upward, it's the kind of stuff that they're learning in school anyways. So, you know, bolstering this up with home activities can only be in their interests. So I want to talk a little bit about vernalization, which comes from the Latin meaning winter. Oh, my dogs have just arrived, so excuse me if there's a lot of pitter-patter of tiny feet. It's not children, it's animals. So there are a lot of seeds, actually, and bulbs that require, strangely enough, a period of intense cold in order for their flowering mechanism to be kick-started. Plants that have vernalization requirements have to be exposed to a number of days of cold temperatures. Otherwise, either they won't flower at all, or the flower head will be really small, really stunted. And the number of days that are chilling, you know, need to be chilled, vary depending on the species. There are a whole bunch of seeds as well, actually, if I go on a bit of a tangent, that also require a period of, you could sow them and just put them in the freezer for a number of weeks and take them out. Again, that might be for another presentation. So what happens is that when a bulb is in its dormancy state, right, it's feeding, it stays alive through using the nutrients, the carbohydrates that are in the storage body. Planting, it will start putting down roots. Pre-bloom is about February time. Bloom time is March, April, and then it will prepare for dormancy again as the leaves start to break down and send the starches back into the bulb, into the storage organ. So this period of time here, the dormancy, is the vegetative part. In other words, it is alive, but not flowering and not in a position to go into a reproductive stage. Once it gets to its flowering bloom time, this is when it's in its reproductive stage. Now, what's really interesting, actually, is you never assume that bulbs actually can be developed from seeds. I mean, all flowers die back and set seed. The reason why we, members of the public, tend not to save seed from bulbs and then try and grow them from seed is because it takes years. It's just much faster to buy the bulbs, put the bulbs into the ground. What you will see also is that bulbs will develop, let's see if I got, yeah, these you can see here what are called adorably bulbils. So this is the vegetative development of daughter bulbs, which are clones of the original, right? So this is not through sexual reproduction. This is through asexual reproduction, that you can just separate them. And you see this with the lilies up here as well. Sorry if this is making you dizzy. Can you see here that they're these sort of daughter bulbs? And the reason why they're daughter bulbs is because they are clones of the mother. Anyways, so the key to a successful display of bulbs is planting deep. Now, bulbs you tend to buy them in packages. And the great thing about bulb packages or seed packages is that you don't have to be a horticulturalist to know how to plant them, because the instructions are actually on there. The rule of thumb has always been to plant about double the depth of the bulb. So if a bulb is this, long, deep, you're advised to dig a hole this deep. What I've been reading recently is that the deeper you plant a bulb, I mean, obviously not if you plant a meter, because it's not going to be able to get its flower stem up. But if you plant, let's say, 4 or 5 times the depth of the bulb itself, this is going to stop the development of these little side bulbils, the daughter bulbs, these clones, little clones bulbs that will cluster around the main organism. And all the energy will be put into the flower spike. Having said that, if you want a kind of meadow look, so you're naturalizing plants, bulbs in grass, and you want to look like this, then yeah, by all means, put it in 2 or maximum 3 times the depth. But if you want really showy, like really showy display, then plant them really deep to about 10 centimeters, and you will get a fantastic display, particularly if you want cut flowers for inside. That's the key to this. Now, what I want to finish up with, and Holly is going to pick up where I left off, and this is where the whole awareness of biodiversity, of encouraging beneficial insects into your garden. Beneficial insects are those that are pollinating insects, right? So they're capturing pollen from the inside of a flower. The male parts of the flower, the stamen, are full of this sticky yellow substance that carries the male reproductive DNA, the kind of as if sperm, to the next plant. That will rub off onto the anther, which is the female reproductive organ. And as we all know, egg and sperm come together, create egg. Of the next gen, create the fertilized egg, which creates the next generation. If you buy highly cultivated bulbs that produce an incredible display of stripes, of frills, of unusual colors, there's no doubt that it looks great, but these are a result of a tremendous amount of breeding. And the focus is on the ornamental. The byproduct of intense breeding and cultivation is that there's no pollen left. And therefore, whilst it might look fantastic in your garden, you're not going to get a single bee, fly, hoverfly, insect, wasp attracted to the garden, to these flowers, because there's no food stuff in them. And on the back of that, That's something for you to think about when you actually buy bulbs. Go for British natives. They're a little bit more expensive. You can buy them online. They're not quite as showy as all of these, but you will know that in terms of biodiversity and making this small contribution to the health of the neighborhood, the environmental health of the neighborhood, you would have done your bit. So with that, I am going to pass over to Holly, who is going to take over from me. So if you hold on 1 second. Let me
Dina, while you're working on that,
yes.
is it, this is Sherry, is it okay also to just speak about like anti-squirrel theft strategies?
Oh yes, I've got a fantastic anti-squirrel theft strategy, which is the simplest thing in the world, which is wherever you plant bulbs, just put down a few sprigs of holly or pyracantha or any other plant that's got butcher's broom, that's got really sharp leaves, and that will detract from squirrel depredations, because it just pokes their bottoms and their very sensitive noses. Or if you don't want to do that, then make sure that you really net that area, because especially with tulips, yeah, squirrels have a very sophisticated nose for tulips, and it's really annoying. I mean, everyone has to eat and make a living, but it's annoying when you lose all of that to a squirrel. So is there anything else that...
Sorry, could you repeat the last bit you said about which species, what to buy in terms of biodiversity? I kind of missed that.
Yes, of course. So what I would suggest is to look for British native bulbs. So in terms of daffodils, I know for sure they're called Tenby daffodils, Tenby daffodils. Those are the British natives, and those are the ones that would have been all over the Lake District, that inspired William Wordsworth to write his poem about daffodils. And as I say, anything that is a native as opposed to a cultivar will have pollen attached in it. So is there anything else that anybody would like to ask, or are we leaving questions to the end? And otherwise, I'm going to pass over to Holly. Hang on 1 second, and let me do that. Make host. Right, over to you, Holly.
Hi, cool. Thank you so much, Gina. That was really fascinating. I think I've definitely been overlooking how much there is to know about bulbs. I just kind of throw them in the ground and hope for the best. But yeah, you've kind of inspired me to think a bit more about that. So yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and you also kind of left very handily on biodiversity and pollinators. So that's what I'll be talking a bit about today. Okay. How do I... Okay, cool. Okay, so pollinators, we've already heard that they transfer the pollen from the male part of the plant to the female part of the plant. So they're so important for us, our livelihoods, our well-being, our existence. So insects and other animals pollinate about 88% of flowering plants across the world, about 35% of our crop production. About a third of what we eat is pollinated by an insect. And yeah, so Dina very handily referenced Einstein there, the quote about if our bees disappear, then humanity would disappear within 4 years. Whether or not that's true, we know that regardless, our lives would be very boring and miserable. We would have no chocolate, no coffee, no strawberries, blueberries, avocados, almonds. So much is reliant on these insects. There are other pollinating animals, of course, so birds and bats in other countries, but in the UK, our pollinators are all insects. Okay, the other thing is, I think we underestimate how many pollinators we have in the UK. So there's about 4,000. pollinators, but we know very little about most of them, apart from the charismatic species like the honeybee, the bumblebee, and some butterflies. Okay, so what has happened to our pollinators? I'm sorry, I'm going to start on quite a depressing point, but I promise it gets more hopeful at the end. There's been serious butterfly declines in the UK, so 76% of the UK's resident and regular migrant species of butterfly have declined in either abundance or occurrence over the last 40 years. Over a third of bumblebee species have declined by 70%, and 2 UK species have become extinct in the past 80 years. And one overlooked species or type of pollinator is the hoverfly. So there's been about 50 to 70% of hoverfly species declining in the southeast of England. But there's a caveat to that because they seem to be doing better in Scotland. But overall, pollinators are in decline, and that's quite worrying for us. Why have they declined? Okay, so firstly, loss of habitat. Since World War II, we've lost about 98% of flowering grassland in the UK. Also, agricultural changes to more intensive methods, so getting rid of hedges and just generally all these monoculture intensive agricultural spaces. Insecticides are a key thing. So, for example, I can never pronounce this correctly, but neonicotinoids. They cause a really horrible effect in bees. So they'll become paralyzed. It causes cognitive problems. Unfortunately, I've seen quite a few bumblebees in my time fall victim to insecticides. It's a really horrible thing. Their tongue will stick out, and I've tried to revive them, but once they've been affected by an insecticide, yeah, there's not really much hope there. Disease, as we're importing honeybees from parts of the world, it introduces disease. And also climate change is one that we tend to overlook when we're thinking about insects. But for example, I'm going to speak a lot about bumblebees because I'm a volunteer for the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. Bumblebees are my thing, but I think also they're a really good case study and example of pollinators in general. So bumblebees in particular originated in the Himalayas. We'll come on to this in a little bit more detail later on. But as the climate changes, as we get higher temperatures in the UK, it may affect bumblebees in the long term, and other pollinators in general. And feel free to interrupt me at any point if there's any questions as well. Okay, so what are bumblebees? There's around 250 species of bee in the UK. 24 are bumblebees. One is a honeybee, so only one of these makes honey, and the rest are solitary bees. They are all part of the family Hymenoptera, so bees, wasps, ants, and sawflies. But we're going to be looking at the genus Bombus, which I think is a perfect name for the bumblebee genus. There's around 250 species worldwide, and they have an annual life cycle. So this is the crucial point about when we're thinking about what to plant, because we're going to be looking at all the stages of the bumblebee life cycle and then think about what to plant at each of those stages. They feed exclusively on pollen and nectar, so they get the pollen for growth and nectar for fuel, and they're predominantly found in the Northern Hemisphere. So if we look at these photos here, the one at the bottom is the bumblebee, but there's lots of other bees to think about as well. So we've got the honeybee, the mining bee, the red mason bee, solitary bee, and tawny mining bee as well. But there's, as I said, there's 250 species of bee in the UK. Okay, so gardening for bumblebees. Interestingly, some bumblebee species are now more common in gardens and parks than in the countryside. So this is where the hopeful bit comes in. We can really do something to help pollinators in our garden. In some ways, it's a a haven for them, and they're doing better in these spaces. And when you put that into perspective, so gardens cover more than 1 million hectares in the UK, so that's a huge amount of land that we can really help to restore and create these spaces for pollinators. As I mentioned before, it's important to have the right plants that provide nectar from February to October. So that's quite a long span of time. And when we're thinking about gardening and what to plant, we can think about each of these points during the year that are really crucial. So actually, earlier on in the year is when the queen emerges, and sometimes there isn't much around because we like this sort of summer explosion. But especially when we think about what to plant now, think about bulbs, think about what will emerge in spring, that's really a lifeline for a lot of pollinators. Okay, and as Dina mentioned, a lot of the common bedding plants aren't very good for bees. Firstly, they produce little or no nectar or pollen, and they've been bred to look nice and showy, but it's also hard for the bees to access. Okay, so a little bit about the bumblebee life cycle. I think this is really fascinating, and it's something that we don't really know about, or we don't appreciate how complex their lives are. So firstly, starting in the bottom left, we've got the queen. She's hibernating, so she hibernates during winter, and then she'll emerge around March time, and that's when she will go crazy and feed on all the plants that she can. And as she's feeding on all this nectar, she also collects pollen, and she brings the pollen back and creates a nest. So you can see in the top right, those like little capsules. So she builds these little capsules of pollen and wax, and lays the eggs in there, so the larvae will hatch in this nest. And it's actually kind of similar to what a bird does. So she'll incubate the eggs, and another really nice thing that I find really cute is that she'll build like a little basket out of this wax and put the nectar that she's collected in there, so she can sit on the nest and just like drink on the nectar out of this little pot in front of her. And then the eggs will hatch, and the first brood is the female worker bee. So they'll go off, they'll collect more nectar, and bring it back to the nest. So the colony of a bumblebee is a lot smaller than a honeybee. It's about 100 individuals. And then the second brood is the male workers and the new queens. So the new queens will mate with not the male workers, just the male bees and the new queens. And so they'll mate, and then the new queen will start the cycle again. She'll hibernate during the October to around March time, and then the cycle starts again. So it's quite a complex life, quite a complex social structure as well. And so we'll be thinking about what to plant at each of these different stages to help them along throughout the year. Okay, so that's the first thing to bear in mind when you're planting. So this is a little fact, which I think kind of puts into perspective why we need to plant for bumblebees in particular. So we think mostly that insects are cold-blooded, and generally they are, but the bumblebee can actually be considered warm-blooded. So like I said before, they originated or evolved in the Himalayas. They have these fluffy jackets to keep them warm. But the other thing is that they can't fly. So they do fly in temperatures around as low as 10 degrees Celsius, but they can't fly until their wing muscles reach about 30 degrees Celsius. So what they do is they uncouple their wings from their thorax muscles and then just shiver. So you might see, especially on cold days, you might just see a bumblebee just on its own, kind of shivering, and it'll be grounded. but in order to take off, they need to shiver and warm themselves up. And obviously this takes a lot of energy, so they've got a high metabolic requirement. And so that means that they need to eat a lot. So they need to feed around every 30 to 40 minutes. Otherwise, they're always about 30 minutes from starvation, essentially. Yeah, so I think that's quite cool that they're warm-blooded. And yeah, so this is a thermal image of the bumblebee. Okay, so the second thing is that, which I think is why bumblebees are a good umbrella species for most pollinators. So that what I mean by that is, if you plant for bumblebees, you're probably planting for a lot of other pollinators as well. We can divide bumblebees into those that have long tongues and those that have short tongues. And long tongues are also found in moths and butterflies, whereas short tongues are found in hoverflies, beetles, solitary bees, honeybees, and some bumblebees. Okay. And so as I go through the plants to plant at different times of the year, I'll say which ones are good for short tongues and which ones are good for long tongues. And this, if you're keen to take the next step, this is a good thing to bear in mind when you're thinking about the diversity of what you want to plant. I've tried to keep it bulb heavy, since that's the topic of the talk. But as we get later on in the year, you'll see other ones, other types of plant creeping in. Okay, so just to recap, what bumblebees need and what we can provide for them is somewhere to nest. So they nest underground, in sort of old mouse nests or bird boxes, if it's the tree bumblebee, or under sheds. Sometimes you'll see a lot of bumblebees coming out from under your shed. Yeah, anywhere undisturbed, log piles, anything like that. Somewhere to hibernate, similar kind of thing, and lots of flowers for food. Okay, so first of all, when there's the nest establishment in spring, the queen has emerged, she's looking for food. We've got daffodils, bluebells, fritillaria, or snake's head fritillary. I think this is a really cool plant. It's the one on the right. It's got this checkerboard pattern, which I just think is insane. But this has happened just by evolution, and I just want to know how that happened. Hyacinth, iris, muscari, or the grape hyacinth, wood anemone, and snowdrop. So the snowdrop is an interesting one. It usually flowers before most of the pollinators have emerged. But on a warm day in winter, sometimes a stray honeybee might think that it wants a snack during its hibernation, and so they still do provide food for some of our pollinators. Okay, so as the colony grows, this continues throughout spring and summer. You've got alliums, there's so many, they're really great for bees, especially the Sicilian honey garlic. I read a tip about that is really good at attracting early bumblebees. And different types are good for both short and long tongue bumblebees. So if we're looking at these two, so this one at the top is a Sicilian honey garlic. It's got this trumpet shape. So anything with a trumpet shape is usually good for the longer tongued insects, whereas the one at the bottom, it's got smaller flowers, they're more easy to access, so better for insects with shorter tongues. Agapanthus, crocosmia, chives, self-heal, apple, comfrey, green alkanet is not one that I would recommend you plant because it's a weed, it does spread, but I included that just because if it does crop up in your garden, maybe leave it for a bit. It's really good for pollinators. But yeah, I'm not encouraging anyone to go and plant it. Okay, so the other thing that I like to include are plants that have a use. So a use for us or a use for other wildlife. So things like chives are edible, self-heal, medicinal. So yeah, think about as well what other benefits you can get from these plants. Mid to late summer is when you got the fledging of new queens and males. So things like dahlia, passion flower, viper's bugloss. Sorry, we're drifting away from bulbs a little bit. St. John's wort, teasel, really good for birds. Mint, runner beans, ice plant. There's loads that you can plant during this time. Yeah, and that's it. Sorry, I sped through that quite a bit, but yeah, any questions, please let me know. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Sorry, I'm a total noob here, but of all that long list, how many of those were bulbs then? You said you were going away from bulbs. I wasn't quite sure at what point you sort of drifted off.
Okay, so I think I drift off here. So allium, agapanthus, crocosmia, chives, they're all bulbs. All of these are bulbs. So that's what we're thinking about for spring. It's really crucial to have to plant these bulbs in around this time, because the pollinators really rely on these bulbs at this time of the year. As we go on, maybe a bit less, but yeah, so dahlia is a bulb as well. I'll keep this off for a minute.
Of that last list, only the dahlia is a bulb, is it?
Yeah.
Thanks, sorry.
Cool. Any other questions before I
think winter, is it winter acontis is also good for the very early ones, if I'm not mistaken.
winter aconite, is it?
Yeah, winter aconite.
Yeah, that's great as well. Yeah, that's one that I missed off.
And I think these are amazing tips, and maybe a question to both Dina and Holly is about watering. So when do you start watering bulbs? Is it when they're still dormant, or once they've started to show some leaves, or when is the point that you need to sort of start making sure that they have enough water?
That's a really good question. I mean, generally, spring flowering bulbs, unless it's a very unusually hot spring that we had a couple of years ago, it's usually rainy enough to keep them hydrated. I mean, if we have an unusually hot spring with very little rainfall, then you would probably need to water, a couple of times a week at the same way as you would the ground. But it's more of an issue of summer with summer flowering bulbs rather than spring flowering.
Okay, so for spring flowering, so the winter aconitis, the crocus, the daffodils, the tulips, there's no need to
tulips flower later, and sometimes it is an idea, if it's just really dry. I mean, the rule of thumb is you see leaves starting to wilt, or the soil looks really dry, or you just know it hasn't rained in a week, then certainly water them. And the rule of thumb with watering is it's better either don't water at all or water really thoroughly. It's not good to just kind of water sparingly, because what will happen is the roots will come toward the surface of the soil searching for hydration, and then that leaves the roots exposed and will compromise the health of the plant. So if you're going to water thoroughly.
And is there any rule of thumbs also on like how closely to plant the bulbs, or is it about giving them some space?
This is very much personal preference. I mean, my personal preference is to have very dense planting. I like it. Again, you will see on the instructions on packaging of bulbs, they will tell you to space them out. What I would suggest, and again, this is personal, is I tend to plant also in groups of sort of 5, 7, 9. Nature, you know, what you're trying to create is a natural swathe. Nature doesn't do straight lines, and nature doesn't do even numbers. So if you want to mimic a kind of quite naturalistic environment, I would suggest that you dig a hole and plop in about 5 bulbs and do that along the area that you want this swathe of bulbs to bloom. And again, if you're doing it in pots, go for uneven numbers. It'll just aesthetically, it just looks better.
And do you put bulbs, like you mix them up? Like if you're going to put 7, you put different types, or you group the same?
I would tend to, again, this is quite personal. Personally, I kind of very much like those block planting of colors and species, but it's quite personal. This is something that we're going to look at actually when we do our in-person planting of trying to create pots that will be containing bulbs that will flower at different points through a season, so that you can have a kind of tapestry of color and form and design. But this is really just very personal, subjective taste.
So,
yeah, I will say, sorry, I would say, so one thing, I agree that block planting is probably the way that I'd go, just because if you're thinking about what a pollinator does, especially if you're planting pollinators, they like a lot of their food in one space. So they don't want to be finding one bluebell and then having to travel a long way to find the next one. So block planting, I think, is slightly better for pollinators in that respect.
And by block, you mean the same species in the same place, a block of it, and then another block of something else. Okay. I think I had another question. Is things that, like, if bulbs fail, usually, let's say, to come back the next year or to bloom at all, what would be the key reasons for them to have failed?
Planted too shallow, I would
Is
suggest.
planting deep also another strategy for the squirrels, or
Yeah,
will they,
yeah,
or will
it
they,
is. But planting too shallow and also not having this vernalization period, if it's not cold enough, those could be 2 reasons why. It's always worth digging them up and replanting them deeper and seeing if that works.
Okay. Any other questions from anyone? Sorry, I've hogged all the questions.
Yes, I have a question. Watering, the moisture, because this is I'm going to call it a root vegetable or a flowering bulb that is underground. And lots of times we're not real keen on the moisture level around the seed. And it could get too moist and rot. So my concern is to manage the moisture level that's going to be required so that I can have success. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, because I don't know whether there is a kind of rule book in terms of the amount of moisture and hydration. One of the things I would perhaps consider before you plant is what is the texture and structure of your soil. If you're planting in very sandy soil, that will have an effect of the kind of leakage and leaching of a lot of moisture.
Good afternoon. I'm failing on Sunday, the 11th of September. I wanted to try and book an evening meal tonight.
Hello,
Ashok,
somebody
sorry.
needs to,
Ashok.
could someone mute
Grateful.
whoever wants to book an evening meal for tonight?
On 078.
Ashok. He's not even listening. Can you mute him, be the host, if you're the host?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, just muted him.
Okay, so If it's a sandy soil, you need to put in quite a bit of organic matter so that there is enough bulk in the soil to hold on to water, so that the molecules in the soil are, there's enough, the airspace between the molecules are not so big that there'll be leaching of water. Conversely, if you're going to be planting into a very sticky kind of heavy clay soil, where those molecules are actually, you will see if you look under a microscope, very, very close to one another. So that's going to hold too much moisture. Then you might want to dig in a bit of sand with it. Assuming that you've got a reasonably average, not too light, not too heavy soil. If you've got a spring where we've got average spring rainfall, then you really don't have to worry about additional watering. But as I said, if you have a spring like we had in the UK 2 years ago, actually as the virus was taking hold, the sun also took hold and it didn't rain for weeks. And then you would, I would water and ensure that there is enough water, you know, sort of hydration in going into the soil. It's a little bit of, you know, just using your intuition and hoping for the best. What I will say is one of the most heartening things I ever heard is in the UK, there is a radio program called Gardener's Question Time. And I remember some years ago, and the panel on Gardener's Question Time was some of the most renowned garden designers, horticulturalists, botanists, you know, absolute experts in their field. And somebody asked, have you, anybody on the panel, ever had an experience of losing plants? And these super duper expert people start talking about the hundreds of plants, bulbs, shrubs, trees that they've put into their gardens, tended to with loving care, and have died. So this, I thought, was immensely encouraging in the sense that we do our best, you know, and sometimes it just doesn't work and it's hard to know why. And that's where gardening is also quite optimistic, because you're disappointed and then you just press on and start again. So that's what I have to say on that question.
So because also of time constraints, I just want to say a huge thank you to Dina and to Holly. Both are experts in these fields. So thank you so much for planning this presentation and then providing us all these great knowledge and tips. And we really are very, very grateful to you. And hopefully everyone are going to plant something, you know, 1, 2, 10, 20, if you have a community garden, even more, and encourage your neighbors to do some. It's a really lovely gift to give to people, some plants. As Dina said at the beginning, if it's a gift of optimism, it's really is a lovely thing to give away. So good luck with planting, and do be in touch. For us in Finchley, we are trying to organize some community planting activities as well. So do keep in touch, and thank you very much.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you so
Have a
much. That was great fun.
afternoon.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you
Bye,
so
one
much.
and all.
Bye.